Hi, this is Caitlin, and this is the Art Life video blog, day 118.
My name is Jacob Wolf. Thank you, Caitlin, for
Yeah,
having me here.
cheers. Yeah, it's a beautiful morning in Portland.
So, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So currently, I work in a historic hotel, but as a passion and as my training, I'm an art historian by trade. I have a bachelor's in art history, but I'll go through that whole, my whole road. It was a kind of an interesting road that led me to actually finish my undergrad. But yeah, art history was something that I became really interested in high school, I guess I didn't know art history was a thing. I actually ended up going to an exhibition at the National Gallery in DC, and my dad took me, and it was all about Dadaist work, like Dada, from, post World War I. Art, and I was just like, I remember being in high school, being kind of, not ignorant to the world. I'd moved around a lot, but just being like, what is this? It literally is absurd. Like, that's what Dada is. But I was just so fascinated with it.
I've never heard of Dada.
Oh, you've never heard of Dada? Oh my gosh. So after World War I, artists and intellectuals in mainly Germany decided that, God, you'd love Dada, decided that the war was so horrific that there is no room for artistic endeavor. What humans have done to other humans, we don't deserve art or beauty anymore, essentially. It's what their philosophy was. So they kind of came up with art of the absurd, where they would, a Dadaist poem, for example, is you'd cut up a bunch of letters or a bunch of words, you put them in a paper bag, and you would just either throw them on the paper or pick them out at random. And so it didn't make any sense. It really was an art of the absurd, because they believed that society at that point was just absurd and they didn't deserve, artistic representation. And they would have these really strange plays that they would make up that just again were nonsensical. It would be everything was in protest to the war and all of the horrible weapons and things that were invented during World War I, that mustard gas and all these different things. It really was a protest to the way that humans were treating themselves. God, it was so beautiful. So I remember seeing this exhibition, and it was a really encompassing exhibition where they did plays, they did poetry, they did all kinds of just weird sound experiments. And it was just all, again, nothing you could recognize, nothing. And they did a lot of publications, mostly in German. But they had all these publications in Germany. And it was so interesting that a lot of intellectuals kind of came together and realized that war had ruined us as a culture and as a society. So, so I became really fascinated with the idea of art influencing history and also becoming a part of history.
Was Dada a way to get around that ban on art, I guess?
Yeah, in a way too. That wouldn't necessarily happen until a little later. I mean, there was a ban on kind of modern art that wouldn't happen until the 30s. And this was really taking place in the late teens, early 20s. But no, it was. So, I mean, it really was for them. They just realized that even modern art, just representing nature, they just realized that they couldn't do it anymore. They didn't deserve it. So for me, that was really understanding that art was influenced by history, and then there's also art could be a protest against not only war but politics and society. And I thought that was so interesting that art could really do that and be that. I don't know, I just thought that art was something you just hung on a wall and then just died there, So for me, I realized, and even now, seeing these Dadaist works that were at that time almost 100 years old, to evoke something in me that was, really powerful. I thought that was really important, and I was like, what is that? What do I do with this? What do I do with this feeling? And so my dad kind of was like, oh wow, maybe she's really interested in this. Let's look at future career paths. So I started looking up this idea of art history, and that scholars were able to kind of take paintings but then go beyond that and go, okay, when was this painting made, and what political environment was it made, and what social environment was it made, how did it influence the people that saw it at the time, or how is the artist actually influenced by the work that they made. And I mean, it was really interesting how art could be like an economy, and how art could be a religion. You know, it is. And when you begin, it's mostly religious works, but and how art really is more influential to a society than people think. So that's where my like kind of interest in our history came.
Right on.
Yeah.
What were your next steps?
So after high school, so I moved around. My dad worked for the government. I moved around a lot. One of the places was Italy. I lived in Italy for 2 years, and I was really young.
A lot of art there.
Yeah, exactly. So I went to my dad, and I was, you know, my mom, and I was like, okay, so I'm looking at schools, like I'm looking at colleges, and I had looked at this place in DC called Catholic University of America, and they were like, oh, you can go do like a semester abroad and go study in Rome and study art history in Rome. So I kind of turned around and I was like, well, why don't I just go to Rome and like study art history in Rome? So I ended up going to John Cabot University, which was at the time there was 2 universities you could go to in Rome that were all in English. One was the American University, and it wasn't accredited at the time, and so I decided to go to John Cabot, and I went and I studied art history there for 2.5 years. And it was, you start with like, you know, ancient Roman history, and then you kind of move on to like medieval, and then you move on to more of a Renaissance, and it was lovely. We had like ancient Rome and its monuments class, where you would literally be, it's an on-site class, and you'd be in Rome and you'd be like, instead of just sitting in a classroom talking about the forum, like you were there. It was it was all I could hope for, like in an education of like art history. And even the medieval Rome and its monuments class, which is the same idea. It's, you know, you were there seeing the transition of ancient Rome into medieval, like Catholic. I mean, it was just amazing to see the culture. You would go down into like the catacombs where people weren't allowed, but we got special permission because it was a university. And you would see like an early portrayal of Jesus as like a youthful shepherd, you know, and this is from probably, you know, the 1000, you know, AD. And it was just amazing to see how the actual Rome was transitioning from pagan, because it was like kind of an early pagan symbol, into, you know, more of like Catholic. So it was amazing to physically hands-on see how art, you know, how these symbols and art has like influenced people in their daily society. So I did 2.5 years of study of art history, and I did Renaissance as well, and it's lovely because you get to do like on-site field trips to Florence, where all the like Renaissance art exists. You know, most of the Renaissance art exists. And I also did one of my loves, and we can get into this even more, it's my specialty fell in love with Venetian Renaissance portraiture, which is like so obscure, but
that's very particular.
Yeah. But for me, it just became like, we were, and it's funny, if any of my like art history friends and of that time like ever watch this, they're gonna laugh at me, because I became obsessed with this one painting in particular that we studied, and his name is Man with the Blue Sleeve, and he was painted by Titian, but he just is like, I'll provide like a photo for you, but he's like sitting, you know, with his like body turned, this beautiful like blue sleeve, and Venice at the time was the like head of culture and society and trade and textiles, and so for Venetian like Renaissance art, it was all about color. They had so much more bright, like vibrant colors than anything that was coming out of Florence at the time. And this portrait especially, was a sign of wealth. Like, I am able to commission someone to paint this portrait of me. And what we learned about this, like, there's not a lot known about this, you know, painting in and of itself, but we learned about just the idea that this portrait kind of surmised the whole idea of what Italians call sprezzatura, which is, it's just like someone who is kind of all-encompassing. They know music, and they're well read, and they are well traveled, and you know what I mean. It was really interesting to kind of learn that just a painting could evoke this one idea about this gentleman. We don't know anything about him, but like, here's what he represents about Venetian culture and life. And I started looking into more Venetian Renaissance like portraits, and I just thought they were amazing. Like Lorenzo Lotto, like was able to, one of my favorites, who was able to kind of just encompass so much just in the face, you know. I mean, it's really important that, I mean, you can have all these paintings that are doing all kinds of crazy things with, you know, I don't know, pastoral scenes or all these different, you know, but it's just to have one person and maybe some symbols like around them of what they did, but just to have so much expressed like in their face and in their eyes, just for me, it was like, you know, taken aback. And this painting actually is in the National Gallery in London, and I had the honor of seeing it. I've actually seen it twice, but it's like one of those things that one of those things that.
Oh, it's good like that.
Thanks.
I thought about it.
Wait, we're filming something and
Oh.
it's fine. Okay. Yeah, so it was one of those things that to be able to see it in person, like I almost like wept because it was just so much. It was a lot smaller than I had anticipated, which is typical of a lot of paintings. But
How big do you think?
it was, I don't know. It's interesting because it's probably like a little bit less than life size. No, it's smaller definitely than life size. I'm horrible with like dimensions. But it was definitely, I thought it was I thought it was gonna be more life size. But it's tough when you're like looking at things in a classroom and you're looking at them on a huge screen and they're being projected onto the screen. And it's so interesting that you're like, oh, this must be huge. You know, there's only one painter that, you know, ever has a larger painting than you actually expect. There's an artist called Veronese who makes these like wall-to-wall, huge like scenes. They're amazing. But this little portrait by Titian, I was just like, you know, I was like, and the fact that he was able to create so much detail in such small size, it was just that you could see on the sleeve itself, not only the detail in the fabric, but there are these little like gold threads that were like woven, you know, in the fabric. And it was, he has this undershirt on that has the little collar is frayed, and then there's like a little gold thread that kind of, you know, connects the collar all together. And it's just, it for me, it was like I was worshiping, you know, this like thing that I was like praying. There's, you know, it was like a very meditative experience to like, I stood in front of this painting for 30 minutes, you know, at a time. And it's funny because there's like an even more famous Titian like to the right of it. And I was like,
And it doesn't have the
it
same.
doesn't have the same, yeah, exactly. And everyone was going through, there were all these tours going through, and they're like, here's Titian's, and I can't remember what it is, of course, because I didn't really care at the time, but, you know, here's Titian's this, and this, and I just kept staring, and, you know, but it was the second time I was there was this man,